Welcome to Betrayal Affairs. In today's video, it's strange how the smallest choices in life can ripple into something you never expected. That morning began like any other, sunlight sliding between the curtains, the faint hum of the fridge downstairs, and the smell of fresh coffee I had set to brew the night before. My mind was already half on my to-do list, half on the quiet tension that had been lingering in our home for weeks. My husband, Daniel, had been different lately. Not in the loud, obvious ways you read about, but in the subtle ones, a longer pause before answering me, a quiet sigh when he thought I wasn't listening, the way he avoided my gaze sometimes. I wanted to believe it was stress from work. After all, the company he managed was going through a major transition. But deep down, in that quiet corner of my mind I rarely acknowledged, there was a whisper. Something else was going on. That afternoon, he called to say he'd be late. Again. I forced a cheerful, "All right, honey," before hanging up. My hands lingered on the phone longer than they should have, the smooth screen cold against my fingers. I hated that it had become a habit, checking his tone for clues, replaying his words for hidden meaning. Around 7 p.m., I poured myself a glass of wine, then another, until the edges of my thoughts softened. The house felt too big and too quiet without him, and so I put on some music, not loud, just enough to keep me from hearing the silence. I didn't expect anyone to come over, so when I heard the front door click open, I jumped a little. It wasn't Daniel. It was Ethan, his 22-year-old son from his previous marriage, my stepson. He had this habit of showing up without warning, usually for laundry or to grab something he'd left behind. But tonight, his expression wasn't casual. He stepped inside, glanced at the wine glass in my hand, then met my eyes with a look I couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded too quickly. "Just unwinding. Long day." He didn't push, but he also didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone while I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to fuss with dishes I'd already cleaned. I could feel his presence, the unspoken weight of something neither of us was naming. After a while, he set his phone down. "Dad still at work?" I hesitated. "So he says." The room went still for a moment. He gave a small, almost knowing nod, then looked away. It was such a subtle exchange, but it sent a rush of warmth and discomfort through me. Did he suspect what I was starting to suspect? Or was it something else entirely? The wine had loosened my tongue, and before I realized it, I was telling him about the distance between Daniel and me, the way he seemed half here, half somewhere else. Ethan listened, really listened, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I told myself it was harmless. Just conversation. Just talking. Hours passed in what felt like minutes. The rain had started outside, tapping softly against the windows. At some point, I noticed Ethan was closer than before, his arm resting on the back of the couch near my shoulder. I should have moved, created space, but I didn't. The warmth from his presence was grounding in a way I didn't want to admit. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "If you ever need someone to talk to, you can call me." I smiled faintly. "Thanks, Ethan. That means a lot." After he left, I sat in the quiet, my heart strangely unsteady. The conversation hadn't crossed any lines, but the unspoken currents beneath it, those were harder to ignore. The next few weeks blurred. Daniel's late nights grew more frequent, and so did Ethan's visits. Sometimes he'd come by with an excuse, returning a borrowed book, picking up mail, but we both knew it wasn't really about that. We'd talk in the kitchen, sometimes for hours. I began to notice the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his voice softened when he asked how I was doing. And I noticed, shamefully, that I looked forward to it. I told myself it was innocent, that I was just lonely. But late at night, lying beside Daniel while he scrolled through his phone, I'd replay those conversations in my head and feel a complicated twist of guilt and longing. One evening, after another silent dinner with Daniel, I poured myself a drink and sat out on the back porch. The air was cool, scented faintly with jasmine. My phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "You home?" Before I could think better of it, I replied, "Yeah." Minutes later, he was there, leaning against the porch railing, his hands in his pockets. We talked in low voices, as though the night itself was listening. I don't remember who leaned in first, maybe neither of us did. Maybe it was just the way the air shifted between us. But in that moment, I realized how far I'd already gone, not in actions, but in thoughts. And thoughts, sometimes, are just as dangerous. The weeks that followed were a careful balancing act. Every smile from Ethan felt like a secret. Every glance at Daniel carried the weight of what I wasn't saying. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, but part of me didn't want to stop. The attention, the feeling of being seen, it was intoxicating. Then came the night that changed everything. Daniel was out of town for a business trip. I'd planned a quiet evening alone, movie, blanket, maybe a little wine. But around 9, there was a knock at the door. Ethan. He stood there with an easy smile, holding a grocery bag. Brought snacks. Figured you could use company. I should have said no. I should have closed the door. But instead, I let him in. We sat in the living room, the glow from the TV casting soft light across the space. At some point, my hand brushed his on the couch. Neither of us moved away. The air between us felt heavy charged. And then he leaned in, just slightly, as though testing the air. I froze. "We can't," I whispered, my voice breaking. He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on mine. "I know. I care about you." That broke something in me. Not in the way you think, but in the realization that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from a choice I couldn't undo. I stood abruptly. "I think you should go." He hesitated, then left without another word. That night, I lay awake for hours, my thoughts a tangled mess. I'd been drifting toward this moment for weeks, maybe months, and now I was forced to face what it meant. When Daniel came home 2 days later, I was different. Quieter. More guarded. And yet, in some ways, more honest with myself. I don't know where my marriage is headed. I don't know if Daniel feels the distance the way I do. But I know this. What almost happened with Ethan was a warning. A line I nearly crossed. And maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to step back from the edge. So when I saw Ethan again, weeks later, I smiled politely, kept the conversation short, and reminded myself of the truth. Sometimes the most dangerous betrayals aren't the ones you act on, they're the ones you almost do. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I told Daniel we needed to talk. "Come in," I said softly. "Just to talk."